That's what we're doing.
Bellefontaine City Council now in session. Please rise for the invocation led by Councilwoman James, followed by the Pledge of Allegiance.
Heavenly Father, thank you for the freedom to gather here this evening. We ask for your guidance and wisdom as we make decisions that affect those who live and work in Bellefontaine. We thank you especially for our military members and first responders who make so many sacrifices to keep us safe. We ask that you watch over them and their families and protect them. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Please be seated. Clerk, please call the roll.
Mr. Reeser.
Here.
Mr. Springs.
Here.
Mr. Ailer.
Here.
Mrs. Baker.
Here.
Mr. Davis.
Here.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick.
Here.
Mrs. James.
Here.
Mr. Springs.
I make a motion that we suspend the reading of the minutes.
Seconded by Mrs. James.
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
Mr. Springs.
Yes.
Mr. Ailer.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
Mr. Davis.
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick.
Yes.
Mrs. James.
Yes.
Are there any additions or corrections to the minutes? Seeing none, we'll move to administrative reports. Mayor's office, Mayor Chris.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good evening, council. I have no report.
Any questions or comments for the mayor? Seeing none, we'll move to Service Safety Director, Mr. Dodds.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good evening, council and guests. Just very quickly, just want to prepare you all for the next several council meetings. There'll be a busy agenda as we are rapidly approaching the end of the year here. So I hope to have several end of the year ordinances in front of you for next week. So I'm sorry, for next council meeting on November 12th. So just be ready for that. Other than that, I'm going to defer the rest of my time for Chief Marlowe. I know he's got a small presentation for this evening. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dodds. Any questions or comments from Mr. Dodds? Seeing none, we'll move to Law Director, Mr. Stahl.
No report this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shawley. Any questions or comments for the Law Director? Seeing none, we'll move to Auditor, Mr. Brentlinger.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have no report this evening.
Thank you, Mr. Brentlinger. Any questions or comments for the Auditor? Seeing none, we'll move to Police Department, Chief Marlowe.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good evening, guests. As Service Director, I have a small presentation, which I'll do last. It'll only take a few minutes, and part of it is just reporting back to you on some grant results. But the first thing I wanted to mention was that the two officer candidates that we had in process have now made it through their psychologicals and passed. They're in the middle of their medicals, which we should have the results of at the end of the week. Those medical exams are required by the pension board. So once those are successful, we'll be able to coordinate with them there. Get them sworn in and have two of our three empty positions, hopefully filling at that point. Second is, I got word that, if you remember right, we took delivery on a pickup that we've been waiting on. The two Explorers that we had on order, we have one that's now scheduled for delivery, and the other one is showing in production, but it hasn't been actually scheduled into production yet. So those seem to be moving forward as well. So I would expect that in short order, we'll take possession of at least one of those Explorers. That Explorer was specifically ordered for the K9 unit, if it's the correct one. And so that will go to him. He has currently has the highest mileage in the fleet, about 170,000 miles on the K9 unit right now, which is way too many. But as you know, we've been waiting on cookies for quite some time. Beyond that, we're as of Friday, the position for the police lieutenant has posted. That is just to fill the vacancy that I left when I was promoted and Chief Stanley retired. So that's moving forward. All four sergeants are eligible for that position at this point. However, they don't all have to compete for that position. So they have about a 2-week window to apply. So we'll see at the end of that who's interested. Outside of that, so if you recall, some time ago, we applied for an award, were awarded a grant for a juvenile violence prevention officer that the state flubbed up and rolled out so late that it was unusable because it was supposed to be for last summer. They didn't roll it out till like almost Christmas, and it was like, what do we do with this money now? It was written for a summertime position for an SRO that wasn't obviously in the school. So they said, well, you can rewrite it. So we had the thought that, well, in the past, we've written that for like a criminal interdiction officer, a narcotics officer. And we had written that successfully. So we rewrote it for that, thinking, okay, right now we're sitting at 26, which is too few to have anybody working narcotics, because at one time we had 3 working narcotics. We were at 0, like there were no narcotic investigations. We were awarded the change and an extension, which just ended in September. So it ran for about 6 months, from April-ish to the end of September. And so that made me think that I wanted to present to you some of the results that came out of that, because what we were able to do was with 2 of the hires, we were able to push a narcotics detective back out into the field and start actively investigating narcotics full-time. And then we were able to bring Officer Long on with the grant, because it paid for his salary during that window for him to work some of that criminal interdiction. And the other piece that fit in there, if you remember, we had to retire Canine Booty because of issue 2 in the marijuana laws. And he was in training all summer, but when he got back, we assigned him full-time to that as well. Let's see if I get the buttons right. Well, so if you remember right, that was the termination of the Bellefontaine contract that took us from 31 to 26 and left us with 0 individuals to work narcotics. That eliminated the prior criminal patrol unit, and our narcotics investigations actively ceased, as I said. With the increased staffing, though, that started under Mayor Stoller, and as I just explained, Kenan Budik retired, the grant was rewritten, so we were able to stand it back up. So that again brought in the narcotics detective. Pyro came back from training with his new partner, or with Jared, his new partner, and that was due to the poor rollout of that grant, I would guess. Hey, Jared. So I know you haven't got to meet Pyro yet. He's very friendly, so I thought I'd have him. You will walk up in here so they can see him, and then they'll just see the picture. So Pyro is our narcotics dog, and he's the one that's not certified in marijuana. But he also does patrol work for us, so you'll see some of the results of that too. That's a good idea. Touch it all. Of course, some of the caveats is we push to 31, our fully authorized strength, it becomes less of a concern that we lose these investigators again. And that kind of represents the true minimum of the agency at 31, because then we're able to do these sorts of things and keep that stuff out of our community. So as a result of just the last, again, I'm talking the last 6 months of work, we've had 7 illegal weapon seizures, 26 arrests, 8 misdemeanor arrests, 18 felony arrests, for that whole host of narcotics that you see there. I believe Aaron, correct me if I'm wrong, thousands of dollars in cash, seizures out of narcotics. Pyro's canine deployments numbered 19. Shell casing recoveries out of a shooting, 2 no-bite apprehensions out of a burglary during this time, 6 illegal weapon seizures on its own, and of course, the hand in the narcotic seizures. The rest of these are just pictures of the results that I thought you would be interested in seeing. So some of the cash, and this is illegal marijuana, because there are still circumstances it's illegal to possess. Of course, then you have a host of fentanyl, meth, crack cocaine, which is most of what you're going to see here. Weapons, handgun, shell casings that he was found, another weapon. It's not cooperating. More. Another handgun, ammunition. So, multiple weapons out of that seizure. That was out of a car that they got stopped. All in one deal. And what all was in that car, Jared? Do you remember? Was there cash too?
Heroin was in that, 3 pistols, the 1 rifle, and that was out of a canine sniff. So without the dog, all that would have still been going down the road.
Yeah, so everything you just saw and everything I wanted to report to you started because of the grant. We've been able to continue it because of your support and the support of the administration and helping us hire people. Otherwise, all this would have been coming into the community. I thought you'd be interested in that. Ends my report, Mr. President. I'd be happy to take any questions, and Jared and I would be happy to take questions about the cameras.
Thank you, Chief. Any questions for the chief? Mr. Ayler, did you have a question or you just?
No, I
waving?
was waiting to hear.
Raise your hand.
He wants to play fetch.
Yeah, certainly.
I'll play fetch.
Good boy pets later. Okay,
Yeah.
let's finish our business. All right. Okay. No questions. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate your time.
Adjourn some other time.
Yes, you got it. Whatever you want to put the suit on, you let me know.
Fire Chief, Chief Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I had the report tonight.
Okay, thank you, Chief. Any questions for Chief Wilson? Seeing none, I have engineering, Mr. Bischoff.
Thank you, Mr. President. Two things tonight. Number one is our Richard Avenue Waterline project. We'll start here probably in the next week or 10 days. We have our pre-construction meeting tomorrow. And we should get a pretty detailed schedule then. They do want to try to get it essentially complete before we get some bad weather for the winter. The second thing is a piece of legislation you have before you modifying chapter 1127 of the zoning code. This went through planning commission a few months ago, and this really stems from, we met with the prosecutor to discuss trailers, parking, RV issues, things like that. And when she reviewed the code, it was less than impressed her, we'll put it that way. So she recommended that we look at the property maintenance code that was updated in 2018 and use that type of enforcement violation and the steps in the progress for that. So about 90% of the changes you see there, we copied from the property maintenance code and inserted into the zoning code to follow that same procedure. The other thing in here is we did add a little caveat for RVs when they're parked on property. This isn't parked on the street. We do deal with quite a few of RVs that show up parked on vacant lots. They get moved to another vacant lot, and they just go back and forth. So hopefully this closes some of that loophole as well. But that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Mr. Bischoff. Any questions for the engineer? Thank you, sir. Economic development, Mr. Volrath.
Thank you, Mr. President, good evening, council administration. Just wanted to make one quick observation for you. I don't know if anybody saw the Columbus Dispatch article in the past week. It's talking about population for the state of Ohio, expected by 2050 to drop by 675,000 people. And I think only 15 counties in the state were projected to have any kind of growth. Logan County was not projected to have growth, or projected to have 5 to 10% decline. Whether that holds true or not is pretty much yet to be seen. This is through 2050, and I think we've seen that over the years. The census has continued to project decline in our community, and I think we've bucked the trend a lot on that. I think it just goes to point out again the significant work that's happening. Mr. Levan has been putting so much time and effort into, and the city's putting effort into. Almost the majority of those counties that are growing are Central Ohio. Franklin County, Delaware County, Fairfield County, Union, Licking, all around there. There's a couple, some down in Cincinnati, but predominantly it's Central Ohio. And so some of that will come out here. And I think as the developments that we're working on here in the community and others take off, we will see wins from that. The challenge that happens in communities like ours is the natural death rate exceeds birth rate. And so we do have an aging population. And so what's happened is we're working to kind of offset in some ways. So even as we have population growth expected from the 63 new homes that are platted for this development on the Ridge, you have to keep in mind that there's others that are declining at the same time. So again, just appreciate council's efforts to continue to encourage housing in our community. I think it's going to be a really important thing as we go forward and trying to offset some of those natural things that are happening in our area. Be happy to share that article with anyone if you haven't seen that yet. I'll share it with administration. So, That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ballrath. Any questions or comments from Mr. Ballrath? Seeing none. Thank you, sir. I don't see any other members of the administration in the audience, so that will conclude our administrative reports. We'll move to reports from standing committees. Finance Committee, Mrs. Baker.
Thank you, Mr. President. We have 3, 4, and 5 ordinances for first reading this evening. The 2480 is to enter into contract with Motorola Solutions for the fire station alerting system. This is at a cost of $676,213. This was already in the capital budget for 2024, although that work probably won't happen until 25. We're asking for first reading only on that one. 2481 is supplemental appropriations for to set the ARPA retention bonuses. The safety services were already compensated during this ARPA funds are from the COVID era, and this will cover all the other employees. So we're asking for first reading only on that one. 2482 is a supplemental for the park department to cover for the rest of the year for the parks. That one is also first reading only. 2483, we're asking for first and final, so we'll be asking to waive the 3 reading rule. This is to enter into a grant application writing agreement so that we can accept the 2024 Assistance to Firefighters grant to fund the new tanker truck with an estimated cost of about $601,000. So that would be first and final. And then 2484 is a master services agreement related to the Bellefontaine Regional Airport. We're asking for first reading only on that one. And then ordinances for second reading is 2478. That's the compensation for mayor, law director, auditor, treasurer, president of council, council members, clerk of council. And this is for 2026. That would go into effect. And then we have one ordinance up for adoption this evening, and that is for to allow the city to pursue the municipal recreation bonds that Mr. Fissel described us a couple meetings ago. So we'll ask for adoption on that one. Also, because of the hearing next meeting, finance will be meeting at 5:45 for council on November 12th. And also, I'd like to make a motion that we go into executive session at the end of the legislative meeting before we close in order to discuss possible sale of real estate.
Okay, I'll let you make that motion officially in the comments from council section. When we get there, Chair will recognize you, Mrs. Baker, for purposes of making that motion. Does that conclude your report?
That does, thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Baker. Rules Committee, Mrs. James.
Thank you, Mr. President. We have 2 items on the agenda tonight. The first one is ordinance 2485, and this is the one that Mr. Bischoff just explained about chapter 1127 regarding enforcement and violations of the zoning code. And then that'll be first reading only. And the other is ordinance 2479. We'll be asking to waive the 3 reading rule and pass on second and final. And that's regarding the Ludlow Ridge Phase 1 subdivision plat dedication. And the reason for the second and final is that they have buyers ready to purchase lots right now. And that is my report.
Thank you, Mrs. James. Safety Committee, Mr. Reeser.
Thank you, Mr. President. No report this evening.
Thank you, Mr. Reeser. Utilities Committee, Mr. Springs.
Thank you, Mr. President. No report.
Thank you, Mr. Springs. Streets Committee, Mr. Ayler.
Yes, Mr. President, you had asked us at the last meeting for Streets Committee to have a committee meeting. We did last Thursday. Members of the administration were here regarding parking downtown, the vehicles hanging out in traffic. What came from that meeting was, and I appreciate Mr. Bischoff he had mocked up some drawings. One thought was to change the angle from 45 degrees to 30 degrees. But by doing that, we're going to lose about 30 parking spots downtown. So it was the decision of the Streets Committee to try enforcement first. It's going to be more of an educational point of view for the first few months. When we see these vehicles setting out or hanging out in traffic, there'll be some warnings. And then after the first of the year, some enforcement with our officers and our parking attendant downtown. So that's where it stands right now.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Allen. Sidewalks, Curbs, and Parks Committee, Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. President. No report this evening.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Audit Committee, Mrs. Fitzpatrick.
Thank you, Mr. President. No report this evening.
Thank you, Mrs. Fitzpatrick. That will conclude reports to standing committees. We'll now move to the portion of our meeting where we welcome communications from citizens. If there are any citizens in the audience who seek to address council, please approach the lectern, state your name and address, after which the chair will recognize you to speak for up to 5 minutes. Seeing no one approach the lectern, that will conclude the communications from citizens portion of our meeting. We'll now move to our legislative agenda with ordinances for first reading.
An ordinance authorizing the Service Safety Director to enter into contract with Motorola Solutions Incorporated for fire station alerting system and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Baker,
A motion to pass on first reading only.
seconded by Mr. Ayler.
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
Mr. Springs.
Yes.
Mr. Ayler.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
Mr. Davis.
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick.
Yes.
Mrs. James.
Yes.
An ordinance making supplemental appropriations and amending the permanent appropriations ordinance for purposes of ARPA retention bonuses and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Baker,
A motion to pass on first reading only.
seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
Mr. Springs.
Yes.
Mr. Ayler.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
Mr. Davis.
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick.
Yes.
Mrs. James.
Yes.
An ordinance making supplemental appropriations and amending the permanent appropriations ordinance for purposes of park department and declaring an emergency.
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to pass on first reading only.
seconded by Mr. Ayler.
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
Mr. Springs.
Yes.
Mr. Ayler.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
Mr. Davis.
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick.
Yes.
Mrs. James.
Yes.
An ordinance authorizing and directing the Service Safety Director and/or Fire Chief to enter into a grant application writing agreement to apply for and accept a 2024 Assistance to Firefighters Grant funding to purchase a tanker truck and declaring an emergency.
Mrs. Baker,
A motion to waive the 3 reading rule.
seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
Mr. Springs.
Yes.
Mr. Ayler.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
Mr. Davis.
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick.
Yes.
Mrs. James.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
A motion to pass on first and final.
seconded by Mr. Ayler.
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
Mr. Springs.
Yes.
Mr. Ayler.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
Mr. Davis.
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick.
Yes.
Mrs. James.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Move to adopt.
seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
Mr. Springs.
Yes.
Mr. Ayler.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
Mr. Davis.
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick.
Yes.
Mrs. James.
Yes.
An ordinance authorizing the Service Safety Director to enter into contract with Shaw Consulting Incorporated for professional services related to the Bellefontaine Regional Airport and declaring an emergency.
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to pass on first reading only.
seconded by Mr. Ayler.
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
Mr. Springs.
Yes.
Mr. Ayler.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
Mr. Davis.
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick.
Yes.
Mrs. James.
I need to abstain because it affects the family member's business.
Abstention noted and accepted.
An ordinance amending Chapter 1127 Enforcement and Violations of the Codified Ordinances of the City of Bellefontaine, Ohio, and declaring an emergency.
Mrs. James,
Motion to pass on first reading only.
seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
Mr. Springs.
Yes.
Mr. Ayler.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
Mr. Davis.
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick.
Yes.
Mrs. James.
Yes.
Well, that concludes our ordinances for first reading. We'll now move to ordinances for second reading.
An ordinance establishing and providing for compensation for the President of Council, council members, clerk of council, mayor, law director, auditor, and treasurer for 2026 and declaring an emergency.
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to pass on second reading only.
seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mr. Ayler,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. Davis,
No.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick,
Yes.
Mrs. James.
Yes.
An ordinance approving Ludlow Ridge Phase 1 subdivision dedication plat containing 22.626 acres in Lake Township and declaring an emergency.
Mrs. James,
Motion to waive the three reading rule?
seconded by Mr. Ayler.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mr. Ayler,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. Davis,
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick,
Yes.
Mrs. James.
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Motion to pass on second and final?
seconded by Mr. Davis.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mr. Ayler,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. Davis,
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick,
Yes.
Mrs. James.
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Motion to adopt?
seconded by Mr. Davis.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mr. Ayler,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. Davis,
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick,
Yes.
Mrs. James.
Yes.
That concludes our ordinances for second reading. We'll now move to ordinances for third reading.
An ordinance providing for the issuance and sale of municipal recreation bonds, limited tax general obligation, in one or more series in an aggregate principal amount not to exceed $10 million for the purpose of acquiring, constructing, equipping, and improving certain municipal recreation facilities, including recreational equipment, authorizing agreements, and matters relating to such bonds, and declaring an emergency.
Mrs. Baker,
Move to adopt.
seconded by Mr. Ayler.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mr. Ayler,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. Davis,
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick,
Yes.
Mrs. James.
Yes.
That concludes our ordinances for third reading in our legislative agenda this evening. Are there any communications from the clerk?
None for me, thank you.
All right, before Mrs. Baker makes a motion to go into executive session, are there any communications from members of council? Seeing none, the chair recognizes Mrs. Baker for purposes of making a motion.
I'd like to make a motion to, that we move into executive session with all administration and council president and council members to discuss sale of real estate.
All right, we have a second. Seconded by Mr. Reeser.
I'm getting there.
All right.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mr. Ayler,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. Davis,
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick,
Yes.
Mrs. James.
Yes.
It's now 7:58. We'll utilize the room here, and then when we come back, we'll just adjourn. Is the recording off?
Oh, no, it's not, sorry.
That's 30 for you.
You guys have
We have.
Well done, my chief. Thank you. Good information. Started getting nervous, but they mentioned that's not.